Power does not reveal character. It destroys it. The comforting belief that power simply amplifies what was already present in a person is a lie we tell ourselves to sleep peacefully. The truth is darker and more universal. Absolute power does not corrupt the corrupt. It corrupts everyone, no exception. No matter how virtuous you are before obtaining it, no matter how firm your principles are, no matter how much you believe you would be different. Absolute power executes a neurobiological program that rewrites who you are at a fundamental level. It is not a moral test that some pass and others fail. It is an inevitable psychological transformation, as predictable as gravity, as brutal as entropy. And the reason this is terrifying is not because tyrants exist. It is because you, with enough power, would become one of them. The phrase, absolute power corrupts absolutely, was coined by Lord Acton in 1887, but its popularity does not stem from its historical accuracy. It comes from its psychological resonance. We have all observed how power transforms people. The kind boss who becomes a tyrant when promoted. The activist who preaches equality but exploits his followers once he gains a platform. The revolutionary who promises liberation but establishes a regime more brutal than the one he overthrew. These are not isolated cases of hypocrisy. They are manifestations of a psychological mechanism so consistent that it can be scientifically predicted. And that mechanism begins with something seemingly innocent, the feeling of being above the rules that govern others. The human brain did not evolve to handle absolute power. For most of our history as a species, we lived in small groups where power was distributed and constantly negotiated. A tribal leader who abused their position could be challenged, deposed, or even killed by the group. This evolutionary context created internal control mechanisms, empathy, shame, fear of retribution, which moderated selfish behavior. But these mechanisms depend on a critical factor: consequences. When you gain enough power to eliminate consequences, these internal controls begin to atrophy, not because you are evil, because your brain is optimizing its functioning for your new environment. And in an environment without consequences, empathy is an unnecessary caloric expense. Neuroimaging studies have demonstrated something fascinating and disturbing. When people are placed in positions of power, even in laboratory experiments where power is artificial and temporary, their brain activity changes. Specifically, the regions associated with empathy and perspective-taking, the medial prefrontal cortex and the temporoparietal junction, show reduced activity. At the same time, regions associated with reward and goal processing become more intensely active. The brain is literally rewiring itself to focus on what the powerful individual wants while reducing their ability to consider what others need. This is not a conscious choice. It is neurological adaptation. Your brain is doing what it does best, optimizing for your success in your current environment. And in an environment where you have power, success is defined by obtaining what you want, not by considering others. This neurological transformation first manifests in subtle behavioral changes. People with power interrupt more in conversations. They take more food from shared dishes. They park in a way that blocks others. They cheat more frequently in games. They lie more easily. And crucially, they do not experience the guilt or shame that people without power would feel doing the same things. Psychologist Dasha Keltner has extensively studied this and calls the phenomenon the paradox of power. The qualities that help you gain power, empathy, collaboration, consideration for others, are systematically eroded by power itself once you obtain it. Power makes you worse at the skills you used to acquire it, not eventually, immediately. Philip Zimbardo demonstrated it with chilling brutality in the Stanford prison experiment in 1971. He took normal college students, psychologically stable according to prior assessments, and randomly divided them into guards and prisoners in a simulated prison. The guards were given uniforms, batons, and arbitrary authority. The prisoners were given numbers and humiliation. The experiment was supposed to last 2 weeks. It had to be canceled after 6 days because the guards had become sadistic, not gradually, not after weeks of dehumanization. In days, they devised elaborate psychological punishments. They deprived prisoners of sleep. They forced them to clean toilets with their bare hands. They subjected them to sexual humiliations. These were Stanford students, privileged young people with no history of violence, acting with cruelty that would have been hard to imagine days earlier. And here is the crucial part. They did not enjoy cruelty despite the power. They enjoyed cruelty because the power had normalized it. The prison system had created roles where certain behaviors were expected, even required. And once the brain categorizes a behavior as part of your role, cognitive dissonance disappears. You are no longer being cruel. You are maintaining order. You are no longer abusing. You are exercising legitimate authority. Power does not simply allow you to behave badly. It redefines what it means to behave badly, until actions that would have horrified you before become simply part of your job. Zimbardo had to stop the experiment, not because the guards rebelled against their roles. He had to stop it because they had immersed themselves too deeply in them. The Stanford experiment was criticized for lacking realism. The students knew it was an experiment. They knew it was temporary. What happens when power is real, permanent, supported by full institutional structures? History provides abundant answers, each confirming the same pattern. Stalin started as an idealistic revolutionary, dedicated to freeing the proletariat. He ended up killing millions, including his own comrades, in paranoid purges where anyone could be declared an enemy of the state for the crime of existing near power. Mao led a revolution promising equality and justice. His Great Leap Forward caused a famine that killed approximately 40 million people. And when informed of the disaster, his response was to intensify the policies that caused it. Pol Pot wanted to create a utopian agrarian society. Empty cities, executed intellectuals for the crime of wearing glasses, turned Cambodia into an extermination camp where a quarter of the population died. These men did not start as monsters. That is the lesson history prefers to ignore because it is too disturbing. They began as idealists, revolutionaries who genuinely believed they were serving the greater good. But once they gained absolute power, once they could eliminate any voice that questioned their decisions, once they surrounded themselves with flatterers who only reflected their desires, their perception of reality was completely distorted. Every destructive decision was rationalized as necessary. Every atrocity was justified as service to a higher ideal. Power did not make them evil. It made them incapable of recognizing their own evil. It gave them the capacity to redefine any action, no matter how brutal, as morally correct, because it served their objectives. And this leads us to an even more insidious psychological mechanism that operates in all power contexts, not just in dictatorships. It is the phenomenon of moral de-individuation. When you have enough power, you stop seeing the people you affect as individuals with complex lives and inherent dignity. They become abstractions, numbers in reports, resources to optimize, obstacles to remove. A CEO who fires 5,000 employees to increase stock prices does not experience this as destroying 5,000 lives, destabilizing 5,000 families, annihilating decades of work and contribution. He experiences it as a smart strategic decision. Employees are not people. They are lines in a spreadsheet. This is not conscious cruelty. It is the inevitable result of operating at scales where individual empathy is computationally impossible. Albert Bandura extensively studied this process and called it moral disconnection. He identified multiple psychological mechanisms that allow people with power to commit atrocities without feeling guilt. The first is moral justification, where harmful actions are framed as serving higher purposes. Bombing civilians becomes liberating a country. Exploiting workers becomes creating jobs. Polluting the environment becomes promoting economic growth. The second is euphemistic language, where actions are described in terms that hide their reality. You don't kill people. You neutralize threats. You don't torture. You use enhanced interrogation techniques. You don't destroy communities. You implement urban development. Language doesn't simply describe reality. It reconstructs it in ways that allow your psyche to tolerate what you're doing. The third mechanism is advantageous comparison. Any action may seem acceptable if you compare it to something worse. Yes, I am exploiting my employees, but at least I am not enslaving them. Yes, I am destroying ecosystems, but other companies are worse. Yes, I am enriching myself while others suffer, but I am not as rich as billionaires. This logic allows any level of destructive behavior as long as you can point to someone worse. The fourth mechanism is displacement of responsibility. It was not really your decision. You were following orders. You were fulfilling your fiduciary duty. You were doing what the market requires. You were implementing established policy. Power gives you access to structures that can absorb moral responsibility, leaving you technically guilty, but psychologically free. And the fifth mechanism, perhaps the most powerful, is dehumanization. When you have enough power over a group, your brain begins to process them not as complete humans, but as something lesser. This has been demonstrated in MRI studies. When people see images of homeless individuals or addicts, the brain regions that normally activate when processing other humans, the medial prefrontal cortex, show reduced activity. Instead, regions associated with object processing are activated. Literally, at a neurological level, the brain stops categorizing them as complete humans. And if you have power over them, if you can make decisions that affect their lives without consequences for yourself, this dehumanization intensifies. They become problems to solve, not people to consider. And once someone has been dehumanized in your mind, any level of mistreatment becomes psychologically tolerable. But power not only changes how you see others, it changes how you see yourself. The phenomenon of power-induced narcissism is well documented. When you gain power, especially if you achieve visible success, your brain begins to attribute that success solely to your personal qualities. You ignore the role of context, luck, contributions of others, the systems that supported you. You become the protagonist of a narrative where all the credit is yours. And this narrative is constantly reinforced because people with less power have incentives to flatter you. They tell you that you are brilliant, visionary, indispensable, and your brain, flooded with signals of high status, begins to believe it. Not because you are consciously vain, because your brain is integrating the information it receives, and all that information confirms your exceptionalism. This narcissistic transformation has predictable consequences. You begin to believe that the rules that apply to others do not apply to you, not because you consciously decide to break them, because you genuinely believe that you are different, that your situation is special, that normal restrictions do not apply to exceptional cases like yours. Psychologists call this moral hypocrisy, and it is endemic among people with power. The politician who preaches family values while having affairs. The CEO who demands austerity from employees while receiving astronomical bonuses. The religious leader who preaches humility while living in opulence. These are not necessarily conscious hypocrites. They are people whose psychology has been reconfigured by power to create separate moral categories, rules for the masses, and exceptions for themselves. And here is what makes this especially dangerous. Power not only corrupts the individual, it corrupts everyone around them. It creates systems of flattery where telling the truth to power is punished and reinforcing the illusions of the powerful is rewarded. If you work for someone with absolute power, your survival depends on not questioning their decisions. Then you develop what is called anticipatory self-censorship. You don't even wait to be punished for dissenting. You simply do not dissent. You internalize the desires of the powerful and present them as your own conclusions. And the powerful, surrounded only by people who agree with him, receive constant confirmation that their decisions are correct. An echo chamber is created where reality is systematically distorted to protect the worldview of the leader. This dynamic explains why virtually all dictators eventually make catastrophically stupid decisions. Not because they are stupid, because they have been isolated from any information that contradicts their beliefs. Hitler invading Russia in winter, Napoleon making the same mistake, Stalin executing his most competent generals just before a war, Mao insisting on agricultural policies that caused famine, while his subordinates showed him false fields with imported grain to make him believe the harvests were successful. In each case, the leader was operating with a completely distorted map of reality. built by terrified subordinates who knew that messengers of bad news are punished. Absolute power not only corrupts you morally, it makes you epistemologically dysfunctional. It makes you unable to perceive reality accurately because everyone around you has incentives to lie to you. But this is not limited to dictators. It operates in any hierarchical structure with sufficient concentration of power. Corporations where CEOs make disastrous decisions because no one in the boardroom dares to contradict them. Families where abusive patriarchs maintain control because all members have learned that challenging them results in punishment. Religious institutions where leaders sexually exploit followers because their position of spiritual authority makes victims doubt their own perception. Academic laboratories where established professors exploit graduate students because the power system is so asymmetric that victims have no effective recourse. In each context, the same mechanics. Concentration of power plus absence of accountability equals inevitable corruption. And the most disturbing part is that this does not require exceptionally evil people. The Milgram experiment demonstrated this with devastating clarity. Stanley Milgram sought to understand how ordinary German citizens participated in the Holocaust. He designed an experiment where participants were instructed by an authority figure to administer electric shocks to another person, escalating to potentially lethal levels. The person receiving shocks was an actor pretending to be in increasing pain, eventually falling silent. 65% of participants administered the maximum shock, not because they were sadistic, because an authority told them to continue. The presence of legitimate power was enough for most ordinary people to be willing to kill someone. They did not enjoy doing it. Many showed extreme stress, but they continued. The power of authority overcame their own moral judgment. This reveals something fundamental about how power corrupts even those who do not possess it directly. When you are in the presence of power, when you are subordinate to someone with authority over you, your moral agency is compromised. You begin to transfer responsibility upward. You are no longer making decisions. You are following orders. And this transfer of responsibility is psychologically seductive because it frees you from guilt. Every soldier who committed atrocities in every war, every corporate employee who implemented policies that he knew would harm others, every bureaucrat who processed paperwork that sent people to concentration camps, all operating with the same logic. I am just following instructions. The system absorbs moral responsibility, leaving you technically guilty, but subjectively innocent. And this leads us to the darkest conclusion. Absolute power does not simply corrupt the individual who possesses it. It corrupts the entire system. It creates structures where immorality is not an aberration, but a normal function. Where cruelty is not a crime, but a standard procedure. Where exploitation is not a scandal, but a business model. And everyone within the system, from the leader to the lowest subordinate, is participating in this corruption while rationalizing their involvement. The leader says that their decisions are necessary for the greater good. The subordinates tell themselves they are just doing their job. No one feels responsible. Everyone is guilty. The only protection against this systematic corruption is the distribution of power. When no individual or group has absolute power, when there are real checks and balances, when accountability is functional, corruption can be contained, not eliminated, because any power entails some level of corruption, but limited. Functional democracies understand this instinctively. That is why they have separation of powers. That is why they have regular elections. That is why they have freedom of the press. Not because politicians in democracies are morally superior to dictators, because the structures limit how much damage they can do before being removed. Personal virtue is irrelevant. The institutional structure is everything. But even democracies are constantly threatened by concentrations of power. Corporations that become so large they can capture regulators. Political parties that manipulate elections through gerrymandering. Media outlets concentrated in few hands. Wealth accumulated in ever smaller percentages of the population. Each of these concentrations creates pockets of absolute power, where corruption operates without restriction. And the people within these systems From CEOs to legislators to journalists to ordinary citizens, all participate to varying degrees, all rationalizing their participation, all contributing to structures they know are corrupt but feel powerless to change. So the final question, the only one that truly matters, is not whether absolute power corrupts. That is established. The question is what you would do with absolute power. And the honest answer, the one your ego will resist with every defense mechanism it has, is that you would become corrupted exactly like everyone else. Not because you are bad, because your brain would do what all brains do when external restrictions are removed. Optimize for your desires while atrophying your ability to consider others. You would tell yourself the same lies that all the powerful tell themselves, that you are different, that your actions are justified, that those suffering because of your decisions are exaggerating or deserve their fate, that the rules you apply to others do not apply to you because your situation is exceptional. You would not consciously choose corruption. You would simply wake up one day and discover that you have become exactly the kind of person you promised you never would be. The only difference between you and the tyrants you study with horror is that you are morally superior. It's that you have never had enough power to prove otherwise. And perhaps you should be grateful for that. Because the alternative, discovering exactly how corrupt you would become with absolute power, is a truth about yourself that you probably couldn't bear to face. The question isn't if you would become corrupt. It's how much power you would need before you start justifying the unjustifiable, before rationalizing the irrational, before becoming the villain in someone else's story while remaining the hero in yours. Do you know? Do you really want to know? Or do you prefer the comfort of never being tested? Of being able to believe that you would be different, that your principles would remain intact, that power would reveal you instead of destroying you? That belief is the most seductive lie you can tell yourself. And the fact that you believe it doesn't make you virtuous. It makes you exactly like all those who came before you, convinced of their exceptionalism, sure that they would be different, until power proved them wrong. What would power discover about you?